Hey everyone, sorry about that. Thanks everyone for coming back in time. We hope you've been enjoying your day, getting a chance to look at some of the art exhibitions around here. There's a cool booth at the back that basically you can listen to your listen to someone else's voice. There's like a storytelling with generative AI session. There's a bunch of things going on. Also, just a reminder to folks, there's also inclusivity in AI panel happening in the other room. That's with somebody from Mentra. Mentra is this company that Sam Altman invested in. He was actually their first investor. So if folks are interested in attending that session, it's running in parallel in the next room. Um, our next panel in this room will explore the fundamental dichotomy between fostering collaborative innovation through open source frameworks and safeguarding proprietary advancements in closed source environments. I want to welcome to the stage our next panel. It's going to be hosted by Jack O'Brien. Jack is a first-year MBA from MIT and the SVP of content for the MIT AIML Club, and he's going to introduce the rest of the speakers. So Jack, take it away.
All right, great. Ooh. Thanks, everyone. We have a great panel today representing open and closed source, and we have some representatives from both sides. But really, everyone works on both open and closed source in whatever they do. So first, let's welcome Harsha, who's the Director of Responsible AI at Microsoft. We have Arun, who's Chief Scientist at BCG and BCG-X. And Adil from Stability AI, a product lead. Great, really excited to have you guys here. Let's start by just going down the line and tell us what you're working on and how you got there.
Hello, is this thing on? Hey, everybody. I'm Harsha. Thanks for the introduction, Jack. Let's see, I am a director of responsible AI research engineering. I've been at Microsoft 8 years. I started as a researcher thinking about interpretability and privacy in machine learning models. And then over the years, that's evolved into thinking about generative AI. And now my team focuses a lot on building open source tools for evaluating models, building safety systems for models, and thinking a lot about AI for healthcare.
Hey guys, I'm Arun. I don't know if many of you are familiar with BCG-X. X is the build team within BCG. Most of you are familiar in this audience for BCG, with BCG, where the output is nice slides and PPT slides. For us, it's software. So it's an army of about 3,500 data scientists, data architects, software developers, design people, UI, UX. That's the X team. It's a global team. I'm a partner there and also double down as a chief data scientist. So excited to be here.
Hey folks, Adil, and again, thanks for inviting me. So I lead the product management at Stability AI, and if you guys were here earlier this morning, you heard from my CEO, Imad. Yeah, I'll talk more about what Stability itself does at the high level, though. We are making open source AI. We're really trying to make AI accessible to a lot of people. And so my work usually is trying to work with people that are developing applications that use AI. And we're trying to build like a foundation, in a sense, for AI services.
Great, thanks for those introductions. So open and closed source, some people in the room are familiar with what that means. Arun, would love to hear you touch on the nuances of open and closed source, and specifically open and closed source in building and running AI models.
So we work with a whole bunch of clients in a consulting company, right? Fortune 500, name it, we work. And everybody has different needs. With that context, if you think about, let's say, the dynamic pricing algorithm that Uber uses, are they going to make it open source? No. Okay. So there is a time and place for within specific use cases what can be open source and what is not open source. Then there is a level of risk associated. I don't know if many of you are familiar with a company called Veracode. That's a company we use at BCG to kind of for risk tiers associated with different open source licenses. I mean, you guys might be familiar with the different licenses that come with open source. That's the BSD, MIT, etc. And each of them, within the license itself, there are different tiers. there is risk associated. And the risk associated is not because of the licensing scheme itself. The risk associated depends on how much of them are maintained. If there is a break, if they don't upgrade the library, what happens? And again, at the end of the day, nobody wants the data to be sucked into China, Russia. That's the implicit risk, right? So when we think about open source, closed source, the tendency is always to think about like, oh, is it church and state? And I'm like, no, not really. It depends on, both have a place in industry and both will continue to have a place in industry. It's more a question of us understanding the nuances of where it would work when and when to use what.
Great. Yeah. So there's places for open source, there's places for closed source. Let's dig into the case for each, and then we'll start with you, Harsha. Microsoft, big proponent of both open and closed source, but when it comes to AI, all of their foundational tools, the things that we're used to, are underpinned by these closed source models. Would love to hear you talk about really the case for closed source for AI.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do want to stress, right, that this is a spectrum and that there is a lot of open source innovation going on. I mean, I feel a little weird sitting on stage here because I grew up writing open source software and still check into GitHub every day. So, where we're on Microsoft's perspective here, there's a spectrum of models that we're developing, right? Some of them are in partnership with OpenAI, that the GPT line of models that many of you may have heard of. But there's also kind of a lot of innovation going on in the small language model space, right? If we've heard of the Phi series of models, Microsoft is committed to releasing the most powerful small language models of their class as fully open models. And I want to just dive in a little bit about what open really means, right? We heard Imad at the start talk about kind of all these different ways you can think about opening things up. And some of them include weights and data and training code. But open access is also kind of a key piece of this, right? Like we think of this as a foundation. And historically in the research field, many research papers didn't even have like an accessible infrastructure for calling into models and playing with them and building on top of them. So when you think about how that evolution has kind of played out, OpenAI and Microsoft together have at least opened the world's eyes, I think, in some ways to what capabilities are now possible with the foundation just by having an API that you can call and query, even if the weights themselves aren't open, right? Now, when we dive into like the closed source piece, right, getting to the heart of the question, I think there's almost three ways I think about this. Number one is kind of the most boring part. It's a business model question. These things are enormously capital intensive to build, not just in terms of raw compute like many people think of, but the people that you need to train these models, and then the cost of experimentation, right? Like we are pushing frontiers of innovation here, and you're not going to get it right every single time. So when you think about really the layers of costs that are built into this, there is kind of a business model question of how do you return capital to shareholders, right? But that's kind of the boring piece. The second area I think about is like, does it actually make sense to open source some of this? A lot of the innovation we're doing is customizing these models to be tightly integrated with products. So things like Bing Chat or the Office copilots that are wildly custom and specific to the targeted use cases that we're building into our products. And there might not be as much of a case for kind of an opening foundation for people to innovate on top of, because a lot of the innovation we're doing is actually just integration work, right? That doesn't make a ton of sense to open up. Contrarily, when we're building these small language models, of course, there's kind of this opportunity for this entire field of open source developers to start building on top of them. And then I think it makes more sense there too. And then third is kind of a responsible AI and safety question, right? Like we are pushing the frontiers of what these models are capable of. And there are open questions about when and how to release these safely. When I first got access to GPT-4 like 18 months ago, I don't think we had the tools in place to understand what was possible with this, what was coming down the frontier, how it could be used for harm. And now we're looking to industry groups and governments like the Frontier Model Forum and the White House Executive Order to help us understand what these safety thresholds are. So if you really break it down, business model, responsible AI, and then does it even make sense? Like, will people actually get utility out of this is kind of my answer.
Yeah.
Can
I
I
think that
quickly
makes a lot-
follow up on that? Because
Absolutely.
one point I missed when I was describing the definition, the dichotomy, right? Based on the cloud service providers, majority of our clients are kind of constrained in like a Snowflake API or Azure Cosmos or BigQuery. Like there is a level of closed source based on the type of cloud service provider you are attaching yourself to. That's a huge dependency. And if the clients pay a lot of money for the cloud service providers and they want to use their APIs, can there be an open source version of it? Yes. But this is a faster way of doing it. Again, this goes down to like, are you going to compile all your or operating system like a Linux or Unix system, or you're going to use something that's readily available? That's the ease of use, right? So
there's a level of convenience to it and reliability. I think it makes a lot of sense. So let's hear from the other side of building then. I know there's plenty of ways that Microsoft is opening the world and making things open source, but the models are generally closed. Adil, on the other side on stability, the models and the weights and the framework and the code behind everything you build is completely open source, or at least the vast majority of it. Would love to hear your thoughts on really the case for open sourcing and why that's the best for stability.
Yeah, I appreciate what both of y'all said about the spectrum regarding opening up, right? I think there's a lot of open source fundamentalists out there that would say that, well, you need to be completely open in the sense that you need to also enable commercialization, you need to not have any restrictions whatsoever, it needs to be fully Apache licensed and so on. The way that we think of it is, yeah, there are different ways of open sourcing things. We like to use the term open, though. Open means that it is collaborative. Everyone can access. Everyone can look at what there is, audit it. There's a lot of transparency around it, around the data as well as the code and the weights, of course, so you can access it and do what you want with it. Right? Hopefully, nothing, as Harsha mentioned, irresponsible. But to make the case for everything being open, I would say there's two important points I hope everyone takes home. One is around the innovation, and the other is around decentralization. The innovation part is quite straightforward, right? If you have a group of 100 people, all with a free flow of information, able to freely transact with the knowledge that they have about what they're building, you have things like GitHub, and you have things like Hugging Face, where there's a community that develops. That community in of itself is more intelligent and more capable of advancing innovation in that field. That's how all of science is done, right? Archive, which is one of the most popular websites to get any research. You can go and download any paper that we all publish on that site as well. In general, open source innovation is going to be orders of magnitude faster, and any closed innovation is going to be built upon the shoulders of giants that were fully open, right? That's just kind of how it is. Why would you start from scratch when there's an open source library that you can start with? So innovation always happens faster, and we want to help the innovation happen faster across all of humanity, not just within our own organization. And that segues into that decentralization point, the idea that, well, like Imad mentioned, our mission is kind of the activation of humanity's potential, not just one corporation or not just one segment of the population that happens to have access to compute or have access to the knowledge. If you're going to get the billion people in India who likely don't have access to AI to be able to take advantage of this, kind of industrial shift, you need to have those people able to innovate as well. You need to have innovation happening at the edge as well as deployment happening at the edge. And that happens if you are actually making your source code available and allowing people to innovate on top of that. So if we want all of humanity to progress, if you want not just closed places like large corporations or academic innovation, but actually deployment that can help improve human lives, I think you need to get really open with that. And honestly, there's that saying, the rising tide will lift all boats. I hope that applies to the AI revolution.
Definitely, yeah. We hope so too. And I think it's interesting. You're both saying, Harsha and Adil, a similar thing of you're trying to enable access to these models in different ways. Microsoft with all of their infrastructure and getting it into tools, and Adil with actually getting the model weights and the models out there to more people innovating a bigger ecosystem. Arun, I wonder if you have any cases of open source being implemented with, I know you said there's BCGs in hundreds of projects right now, and can speak to them using open source models.
So let me back up a little bit on what we do, right? Done thousands of AI transformations. And again, if you look at dollar impact numbers, it's probably close to $50 billion. Right now we have like more than 120, 130 Gen AI efforts ongoing. Most of this is, when I say transformation, it's not just the algorithms. We have the saying, which I very strongly believe, it's called 10-20-70, which is like 10% is the algorithm, 20% is the engineering, and 70% is the transformation, the enablement, and the change management. And that change management is predicated on explainability. Unpacking the model to make sure that somebody who's like doing supply chain management, like allocating resources, like he or she understands why the model is recommending something and doing that. And that which goes down to the model explainability part. And there is so much white space there. I mean, BCG has released an open source library called Facet to just do that. Because for us, it's a major white space. Because algorithms doing 99% accuracy is great, but guess what? You can cherry pick your data set to figure out, like, to get the 99% accuracy. But that cannot be fluke for us when we deliver code, and that impact has to be sustained. And the person who is implementing or signing off is not a data scientist. So how do you make sure that they can understand that? So again, I'm just connecting it to my work and the BCG clients. And like, so the explainability piece is key in addition to the innovation piece.
I think that makes sense. Black boxes are scary, and we're getting more comfortable with them, but open source allows you to at least take a peek a level deeper. So now I want to transition the conversation to talking about building an open and closed source. And there's a lot of the same challenges in building open versus closed source models, but there's some notable differences. So Harsha, I want to start. Can you talk about really the process of building AI at Microsoft?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the picture I want to paint for everyone is that getting the weights of a model is a very, very tiny piece of building AI, right? There is incredible amounts of infrastructure, of innovation down to the silicon, to the networking, to the orchestration of GPU clusters, right? That all goes into building this pipeline. And Microsoft is an infrastructure company, and I think that building all of that kind of goes unnoticed in some sense, right? So when you think about our partnership with OpenAI and trying to push the absolute frontier of what these models can do, and the scale that you have to operate at in order to push that frontier, innovation comes from all different kinds of places. And then once you have the weights of those models, the first set of pre-training done, there is an enormous amount of work that again goes into aligning them to be well-tuned to follow instructions, to enable application builders to get the most out of these models, to be responsible and safe, of course, and then, of course, to drive down efficiencies, drive up efficiencies so that they are actually like economically feasible for people to use, right? So when we're building these kind of closed source models, we kind of have that vertical integration and this ability to think across the entire stack and drive some of these process level efficiencies that will ultimately get trickled down to startups and people building on top of our foundation. And the challenges there are systems engineering problems, they're machine learning problems, they're ethics problems, they're really across the spectrum, and it's hard to pick just one as like the biggest one, right? But it takes an interdisciplinary field to pull this off.
That's definitely interesting. So you can commit more to the full spectrum of building because you control basically all the value that you create. Awesome. So on the other side of it, Adil, want to speak to the biggest challenges in building open source AI.
Yeah, so Harsha touched on the idea of infrastructure, right? And if you believe, as I do, that AI is essentially the infrastructure for the development of all of the future services and products that people are going to be using. You can see that every day with the next company that's raising, that's an AI or .ai company. you would think, yeah, so AI needs to be infrastructure. Infrastructure tends to be based off of open source software, so we're trying to build it that way. But there is a layer of infrastructure underneath that, and it's infrastructure all the way down, if you ask me. And that layer is GPUs, and GPUs are expensive. GPUs are rare. Sometimes there's no GPUs to get even at high prices and spot instances on Azure, on AWS. And you have to think, how do you get that money, essentially? How do you get a business model that's going to allow you to continue to develop and then open source, which means that you don't get to capture as much of the rents that can be generated from having a completely closed IP. So that's an interesting challenge. Essentially, the challenge is, how do you make money from being an open source AI company? Right? What's the business model?
Got a lot of people's minds. Yeah.
I think Imad touched on this a little bit earlier today, that we have hit upon, I think, what you could say is a two-sided mechanism that will allow us to continue to generate revenues in perpetuity. The first is that the definition of open becomes a little bit more aligned to a club, an open source membership that we have, and it's very cheap for almost anyone, except if you're a very large enterprise, in which you've got to work out a partnership with us. But the implication there is that you are part of what we're doing now. You're a member of what we're doing, right? And whether it is through your support in monetary terms, or whether it's through your own research, you're part of this movement for open source AI. And so that membership model that Imad talked about, I'm happy to talk about more, is it's actually really very effective, right? Right now, there's like 200 million downloads or so. If everyone pitched in $1, we'd be worth a lot, right? If as I see happening, more and more people continue to participate at whatever level they are able to, then this whole community is able to develop, and open source AI in general gets better, but also we as a company are able to continue to afford the infrastructure. But there's an additional side to this. So I mentioned there's a model layer that you can consider infrastructure, and there's infrastructure underneath it. Above the model, before you get to the value creation, there's the orchestration of models, and there's the orchestration of different other services. Like 2 years ago, which is almost ancient history now in the AI space, you would say that you were developing ML pipelines. ML pipelines were the way to get actual value out of machine learning models, regardless of what you were using. That never went away. Now we call them workflows. Now we call them orchestration of different services that are going to be behind an API. And so that's another thing that we're trying to do now. We got our start with image, right? And we have great models and now services across all modalities. Actually going to demo some of these a little bit later. But the idea is that you could do a lot of great stuff with the models, but we can do some very interesting things when we make these workflows work together. And that's not just across a single modality. What if you have a language model interfacing with the image model, and the image model allows you to create amazing videos, and you get full control across that orchestration and a lot of automation as well. That actually is IP that is worth a lot. And that is what we also expect people to build. We're building that ourselves as well. And those are API services that we're making available, and we create reference implementations all the time. And by the way, I hope in this room there are plenty of people that are hoping to build really valuable applications and are going to be building creative workflows, but also using these models. And so I'd welcome everyone to become a member of Stability, and then also build some amazing stuff for the future.
Thank you for that. And we're excited for you're doing a presentation on some of the things you're building with Stability in a later panel. So looking forward to that. Now, Arun, we just talked about building AI and how both of these companies have their different approaches, and they're capturing value in very different ways. And I think we touched upon it with Imad's kickoff, and we touched upon it with the strategic moats panel, but want to hear from your perspective, how are companies capturing value by working with open and closed models?
Devil is in the details. So if you think about like MLlib, I mean, the number of hands which went up this morning on PyTorch, I was quite impressed. So when I talk about MLlib, I'm going to assume that most of the audience knows what I'm talking about. And any advancement in that space, companies are willing to invest a lot more. Okay, and that's many more open source activity happening. But if you think about optimization, like let's say I gave Uber as an example, and like airlines are thinking about like dynamic pricing and like any type of optimization where you have to push in a bunch of business constraints and figure out like how do you want to target the right audience, right? And this applies both to Gen AI and what I would sometimes call as traditional AI. And for me, both work together, okay? Because Gen AI is more like the icing on the cake. If you think about like any kind of an app that is recommending anything, like yes, Gen AI can give you the right language, but guess what? I still need to know as underlying like a business whom to target, when to target, how to target, like where to position. There's a lot more that happens with the traditional propensity models and machine learning models that are underlying. That's what I call as the bread. And then there is icing. The same analogy for like trip planning. A lot of activity happens with Gen AI and machine. Again, it's an optimization problem. But the topmost layer can be like, oh, this is the trip that you should be taking to Tahiti in like middle of December. Great, but guess what? I still need to have a sense for like, is Tahiti the place where I'm making more revenue? Again, you have to put business first, okay? Yes, we are talking about open source and closed source, but at the end of the day, like most people here would understand, this is all like business driven. And like what the business operates with business constraints. And those constraints translate to an optimization problem. And like there, how much of it is going to be open source versus closed source? I would say it's like 50-50. Because some of the optimization problems, like I can guarantee, I was in academia for a long time. I'm a PhD, computational neuroscience, done have a bunch of patents and all that. Like in industry, the type of challenges I've received, I've gone to my boss many times and told, this is like me doing a PhD all over again. Because the type of data, the problem, and the impact, right? I mean, it's not just the model output, it's also like the business output. And it, like I said earlier, it cannot be fluke. It has to work the same way we want it to work today, tomorrow, next week, next month, next year. So there is the innovation piece, and then you juxtapose that with the business constraints and optimization. Answer is probably 50-50.
Got it. I think that makes sense. Do you
Can I
want to
chime in with a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely.
Something Arun said just really resonated, and this goes back to something Imad said in the keynote too. The model is only a tiny part of the story, and a lot of the real value for end users is coming from how you integrate these foundation models or any kind of model into applications and services, and thinking really, really hard about how that integration looks and who your customers are and what data they're working with, right? So I'll give you an example. Probably Microsoft's oldest Gen AI application is something called GitHub Copilot. It is a code assistant, that lives deeply integrated inside of an IDE that developers program with. And it goes incredibly far beyond just kind of a chatbot interface, right, for this. It's reading your code, it's understanding it, it's giving you hints along the way. And we see much, much larger productivity gains from our end users when you've thought through those whole interaction paradigms. In fact, Jamie Teven, who keynoted here, has done some groundbreaking research here in this. But I think we've had a year of people experimenting with just slapping a chatbot in front of things, and that gets you kind of far. But when you go that next mile and you think about who your customers really are in ways that like big model providers don't necessarily know, and then you integrate those experiences much, much more deeply in and get closer to your customers, you see exponential changes in how much utility people get out of them. So there is just, I think, enormous opportunity in thinking of AI as kind of like a foundation, a platform, like Adil was saying, and that's kind of what I would charge the audience with, right?
Great. I think that's a really great follow-up. So let's leave everyone with something really concrete and something to look forward to in the future. And after this, we're going to open it up for audience questions. So start, thinking about if you have a question or two. But Jamie talked about how 15 months ago she pulls over her car and is screaming in the 7-Eleven parking lot because GPT-4 is so insane, and things are going to get even more powerful, more flexible, more energy efficient. There's going to be a lot of changes to the way that AI works in just the next 2 years, and want to go down the line and talk about where you see yourself and your company in building the next wave of AI models. We'll start at the end. Adil.
Start with me. Yeah, the future is really hard to predict, right? In AI space, And I don't want to say like, oh, we approach a singularity over the next several years, and therefore you cannot actually predict what goes beyond. We're actually not in the business of trying to make AGI, right? So that's one hint towards where we might be going. The thing that we're focused on is kind of encapsulated in what Imad said when it tweets often, not your models, not your mind, because we're trying to figure out the opposite of it, the decentralization, the way in which every person can have access to an AI on a device that they have right by themselves, and they can actually do it all locally. They don't need to, API into a service. They don't need to worry about what is being implemented in that. I'll give you one example, right? So there was a report a couple of almost a year ago now, where like 70%-ish of the data used in most language models, it's coming from the United States, and most of that is coming from Silicon Valley. Do you think that the Japanese citizen needs to use that data, or do you think they need like data that is more based off of their countries and their culture, their way of thinking as well? Same thing goes for every country in the world and every type of person in the world, every type of thinking as well. I believe within the next 2 years, this is kind of more my opinion than Stability's, is that we may go towards the direction of what, there's a book Neil Stephenson wrote called Diamond Age, which depicts a kind of a revolution that happens in socioeconomics, right? When the power of AI starts to get decentralized, where a lot more people around the world, in that case, a particularly poor young woman, gets access to technologies that only the wealthy have, and becomes much more capable, much more enabled. That one actually is centered around education. And I've played around with this myself. I have a school in Karachi where I created a little AI app for kids to be able to translate their level of English into a better kind of English, and take advantage of stuff. And their grades are getting better. They're able to do a lot more. Hopefully, they get more opportunity. But you can kind of multiply that experience by a couple of orders of magnitude, and you're going to end up seeing a rise in the global South, where people who didn't have opportunities will be able to do so much more. And that, I think, that's like the rising boats lift all boats. That's like every person is able to do so much more. You're multiplying every new software engineer that just like studies a little bit or does a boot camp or something, and they suddenly become a 10x engineer, a 100x engineer, and so on for every field. So I believe a lot of that is open source, honestly, right? Because it's unlikely, there's not much money in creating that kind of technology for all of those individuals that don't have much to pay for it. But for sure, a lot of capital gets created, I think, rather than destroyed. A lot more capabilities happen, a lot more lives get better. And that's, I think, the direction of activating human potential, which is what we're trying to achieve.
That's great. Arun?
Going to go more with a business-centric view.
There's a lot of business school students in the room.
Yeah, so I am assumed I'm going to fall to the script. If I were a betting person, next couple of years, Gen AI-based like agent layer embedded in terms of like figuring out how you're going to use it for like demand forecasting or allocation optimization, a whole bunch of business things. That interplay of LLM with agent-based modeling is going to be like a huge uptick. I'm going to predict that a whole bunch of startup companies are going to come, and then some would thrive. And like that's my prediction, if you could. And BCG actually open source a library called Agent Kit, which does aspects of what I just described. So we were supposed to set up a booth here, but the lead data scientist was supposed to fly in from London. He couldn't come in. So if you didn't get anything out of my presence here, please go play with Agent Kit. Going back to the prediction, that's going to be a combination of open source and closed source, which goes back to what I was saying earlier in terms of like if you're using an agent-based model to for specific businesses, you would need to go piggyback on some of the open source software that, like, even including what BCG released, and then you're going to use with your own closed source model to figure out like where you're going to get the maximum juice out of, and like make sure that those models work within the constraints of your business. So that's one. The second is, this is my own, like, I mean, deploying machine learning models, AI models for 20 years at this point of time. I'm quite old. There is going to be a world where, like, in the next few months and years, people are going to go back in time to learn aspects of machine learning history. For example, when we deploy Gen AI models, what we've seen recently at least is there is a propensity to go back to ontology models. I don't know how many of you in the audience are familiar with old school, like, knowledge graph ontology models. And those models give a level of certainty for, like, when you prompt a question, what is the truth that you're willing to get? Okay, that truth graph is, loosely put, colloquially put, that's the ontology graph that I'm talking about. So there's going to be a lot of interplay, people realizing that, yes, there is icing, that the Gen AI layer, but then there is the cake, and then there is multiple aspects of the rich history of machine learning and AI, which is all going to talk together to get the juice out of when we go to deploy these type of agent-based models. And that is my prediction for next couple of years. I was here last year, so I'm most likely to come next year. So we can check the prediction next year.
We can follow up next year. Harsha, close us out.
Yeah. Look, I think the question was like, what is Microsoft's role in all this? I think we're committed all across the spectrum, right? We're of course going to support our partners OpenAI in pushing towards their dream of achieving AGI and doing so responsibly. And you have to keep in mind, it's been quite a while since GPT-4, right? So there's frontier pushing work going on there. At the same time, there's lots and lots of work all across the stack on advancing small language models. And I think we just want to be the best platform to enable builders all across, people who are building models, people who are deploying models, people who are using agents. If I had to pick one specific thing, this is where I'll throw my personal bias in. I made and maintain a library with a group of fantastic open source collaborators called Guidance. That's about helping get the most out of these models, getting them to more precisely understand what you want, and kind of reimagining just the plain old text in, text out paradigm. So can we be more precise? Can we borrow from learnings of programming languages and 20 years of machine learning experiences, right, to help get more utility out of these things? So I think there is going to be innovation in inference. I think, and Microsoft broadly is going to try to support the whole stack. We really see this as a new foundation. But yeah, go check out Guidance if you get a chance. Like, while we're all plugging open source libraries, I'll throw mine out there too.
All right, everyone check out Guidance. We'd love to open it up for, I think we have time for 2 audience questions. We have mics lined up if anybody wants to stand up and ask a question. Here we go. We have someone coming from the back. Good time to look up Guidance.
While he's coming up, I just want to maybe make one little prediction. In 2 years, I don't think anyone's going to make PowerPoint slides again. Yeah.
Let's hear it for that prediction.
if I have my way.
I think it was touched upon maybe briefly earlier in the panel. National security and international security, how does it apply into the open versus closed source models? What are implications from your perspectives? What is the self-regulation that you do, and what is the effective regulation that you'd like to see?
I'll answer and say the next panel is going to be about managing risks, and specifically answering those types of questions. But does anybody want to address that question?
Given it's open and closed source, I thought it would be applicable here too.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, we do a lot of work in that space. I mean, I work with federal clients as well, and the security risk is like much different, and the tiers that I was describing for open source, closed source, and like figuring out the policy, what type of red teams need to be in place, and like the governance involved, and like not just the model performance, there's a whole bunch of layers, and devil is in the details there. And that's one response. The second bullet to the response is, I genuinely expected the White House executive order to be a little bit more specific to kind of get to the details. But I mean, it's understandable. I know there's somebody from the White House panel coming for in the next hour, so you can ask the same question to that person. But what your question behind the question is, you want the specifics of what federal agencies should do, and we all look up to the executive order, and that is still getting refined and refined, because the executive order explicitly says that every department needs to talk to each other. Department of Commerce needs to talk to Department of Transportation, to DLA, etc., and then try to talk to each other. So,
Thanks.
Great. I think we have one more question.
Hi, I'm Nico, an innovator building an AI psychologist to support billions of people with the ultimate goal of gathering an AI alignment data set of human values. How is Microsoft focused on contributing and solving alignment through their pursuit to AGI?
Good question. I don't know if I can cover it in 30 seconds, but I'll try. I think alignment is an incredibly important and complex problem, right? I think it also gets painted with a brush of just being all about kind of policing these models, but I don't think that's true. I think alignment is critical for even enabling utility of these, making it easier for people to use, safer for people to use. Microsoft's stance is pretty multifaceted and complex. I think we work very closely with OpenAI on helping them with their alignment stances. We also work with many other model providers. We build a lot of this into platforms that we offer as services for people to help use too. But I know we're over time. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about this afterwards, but just know that it is not an answer that is soundbite friendly, right? It is something that we have many, many people thinking very actively and hard about. And to get to the regulation question too, just briefly, I think we're big fans of regulation. I don't think we have the arrogance to think that we can solve this problem ourselves, and we're looking for industry partners, government partners, everybody to kind of help us, as this is a human level problem, not just one company's.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much. I hope everyone learned something, and a big round for our speakers.